outlining your book is a cornerstone of the Memoir Method program. And if I've learned one thing from working with all of the members of that program, it is that outlining is easier said than done. So today I want to talk through my best tips for helping you get unstuck on your outline so you can get your structure down and move on to writing the thing. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. When you set out to write your memoir, it is not unusual for it to take 2 or even 3 months to get your outline down on paper. But one of the things that I say to all of our Memoir Method members all the time is that when we outline our book, we are slowing down to speed up. So I want to start today by talking first about what I mean by outlining your memoir. Then I want to give you some validation that you are on the right track, that an outline is crucially important, especially for memoir. And then, of course, I'm going to get to my top 5 tips for outlining your memoir in a way that is going to help you speed up once you're done with it. So first, let me talk about what we mean by an outline. Now, one thing that I hear very, very often in the Memoir Method is that the last time folks outlined something kind of formally in a way they would turn in is usually like high school or college, right? And one of the things I think is so interesting as someone who used to teach courses that included outlining is that it seems like a lot of what sticks with folks about outlines is not kind of the purpose or the use. The thing that sticks with us is the formatting, the Roman numerals and then the letters and then the numbers and the lowercase letters. So I want to be very clear here. I am not talking about outlining in that way. For the purposes of what you are doing with your memoir, really any format that works for you. Now, in the industry, if you're doing a book proposal, for instance, or if you just are kind of wanting to follow industry standards, outlines typically do not include any Roman numerals at all. So good news if you didn't like that part. All you are doing when you outline your memoir is you are, number one, figuring out what your chapters will be, what ideas do you want included, what order will they go in. You are, 2, writing descriptions of your chapters. This is a tip I have later, but I'm going to go ahead and spoil it right now. When you outline, if you only do keywords, what very often happens is you will get to that chapter and have absolutely no idea what you meant. So when we talk about outlines for our purposes here, I am talking about an outline that has chapter titles, chapter numbers, and then each chapter has usually about 100, 150 words of description of what goes in there. I also like, for your purposes only, not probably for your book proposal, but for your purposes, to include some bullet points underneath that description that are just going to remind you of any scenes, especially flashbacks, or any ideas that you want to make sure you get in that chapter. When you're outlining, you are in such a different headspace than when you're writing. It is very easy to forget what you meant or what you intended. So really, the whole goal here is to make sure that you have a useful roadmap as you are moving forward on your memoir. What that's going to do for you is a few things. The first and most important thing is that it's going to make sure your story arc is intentional. What I see happen way too often is that people will try to skip the outline and then they just end up with kind of a laundry list of stories, right? They'll kind of start at childhood or even, teenage years, but then it's just kind of story, 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 all the way through to now. The problem is, while that is great for your kind of mental health and processing things, and your family will be very grateful to have that, that is not the kind of memoir that's really going to be saleable or marketable in the industry or in the marketplace. And it's really not the kind of memoir that anyone loves to read. So even your family is going to appreciate if you take this time, slow down a little bit, get an outline down so that you can be building from the point of the origin of the story all the way through to a climax, falling action, all that jazz, the things that we love when we read a good story. An outline is really going to help you do that. It's also going to help you make sure that you understand where you're headed. I called it a roadmap earlier, and that was intentional. When you have your outline solid, when you have written those descriptions, included those bullet points, you know day to day exactly what you're supposed to be working on. You have a clear description of what the goal of the chapter is, a clear list of the things you want to include. You know exactly what goes in that chapter. That is so, so helpful for moving forward. It's also helpful for making your plan. The other thing that happens when you don't outline is that we have really no idea how many stories you're going to include, right? So sometimes that means your memoir ends up being 15 pages long. Sometimes it means it's 1,500 pages long. When we don't have an outline, we really have no sense of how long that book's going to be. When we don't know how long the book's going to be, we don't know how long it's going to take you. So that's another benefit. You are going to have a sense then of how long this memoir will take you. I typically recommend starting with about 20 chapters, about 3,000 words each. That's about 10 pages double spaced. That tends to be pretty digestible for new memoir writers. And when you do that, you know that if you hit a chapter a week, you're done in 20 weeks. It's magical how that kind of clarity can really help you move forward in a way that it's really difficult to do if you don't have that outline. Speaking of moving forward, the other thing an outline that is very detailed is going to do for you is it is going to tell you how much space you have on the page for each of your stories. Remember what I was saying earlier about how people will kind of just start in childhood and move through their kind of whole life basically? When you do that, it's very difficult to know how much to write for any individual scene, right? We don't know how many there are. We don't know how long the book's going to be. We don't really have a target goal in mind. The magic thing that happens when you have a detailed outline is you can look at what all you need to put in that chapter. Say it's 3 scenes and 2 analytic points that you want to make. Okay, you've got 5 things, you've got 3,000 words. Now you know it's about 600 words or 2 double space pages on average for each of those chunks. That is so much easier to accomplish. You know, okay, I've got 2 pages for this scene. You know what you're trying to hit. It's so, so, so helpful, especially when the writing gets to feel like a slog. I will tell you, it's way easier to convince yourself to sit down and write when you know how much you have to write versus when you just are making yourself sit down and see where you go. So, writing your outline in advance, in other words, is a very, very good idea. It is going to help move your project forward so much faster. It's going to give you so much more confidence, and it is really going to make your book better in the end. So, I promise you, it is worth it to slow down so that you can speed up your writing. All right, without further ado, let me give you my top 5 tips for making sure that your outline is not only done, which is great, but also that it really scaffolds and supports the work that you're trying to do as you move forward to write the book. Okay, so my first tip, when you are starting your outline, I suggest not beginning with chapter descriptions, but rather beginning with your structure. So what do I mean by structure? I'm talking about the established structures that we have that we know work for building stories. There are many, many choices out there, and I have another video on this, so if you head over to our YouTube channel, you can scroll down and find the outlining video. That's going to talk through some of the structures, but for a quick recap here, things like the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, other people's journeys. I love that joke. Things like a 3-act structure. Sometimes people will put a different number of acts. 3 acts is the most common. Save the Cat is a really popular one. Or, of course, my personal favorite, the Memoir Method. You can use any of these structures to start with a skeleton, and that's what I suggest you do. So the way that we have people do this in our group program, the Memoir Method, is we first have people brain dump all the scenes, stories, ideas they want to include, put that in a list. Then we have you organize that, sort it chronologically so that you kind of have a sense of what you're working with. Now, from here, it's going to depend on which structure you've chosen, but let me just quickly talk you through how you would do this if you were using the memoir method. So you would start with your brain dump, organize it chronologically. The next thing that we have you do is figure out what the message you're trying to get across is. Then you're going to go into your chronology and you're going to figure out the points in that story that were really turning points for you in figuring out that message, figuring out the lesson that you had to learn. Now, we have a particular technique that we use so that we can help you make sure that those turning points land specifically where they need to go. We call this the quadrant method. We are looking for a turn in a particular direction. We call this the desperate step at about 25% of the way through your story. At about 50%, that's called the midpoint. We are looking for your misguided step where you are taking agency, but probably not quite in the way that you ought to. And then we're looking at 75% for you to have the epiphany. This is where you figure the lesson out. Now, of course, you've still got to learn it. That's how we get to our climax. But as we are working through this in the memoir method, we're encouraging people to pick their chapters, chapter 5, chapter 10, and chapter 15 in a 20 chapter outline, because that will help scaffold the rest. You'll do the same thing if you're using Save the Cat, if you're using Hero's Journey. You're still picking out the moments in your story that correspond to the landmarks of your particular structural guide. So by picking that structure in advance, you can then make your skeleton outline, and skeleton outline, just keywords, right? Just a little kind of blip of what you need to know to remember what you meant. You can outline it in that way first. When you do this, you know your structure is solid, and you can very confidently write out those chapter descriptions, 100, 150 words, like I said earlier, without worrying that you are off track. You will know that your structure is going to work. That is worth its weight in gold. Okay, so number one, choose that established structure. Make sure that you are giving yourself the leeway, of course, to make the story your own, but the established structure like that is going to be so helpful. Okay, the second thing I want you to do as you are outlining your memoir is I want you to think about being as specific as you can while still giving yourself the room to grow and groove and experiment. Remember, while in the memoir method, we try to make this as much of a science as we can just to make sure that people can get through it and feel that they're making progress. Writing is still an art form. There still are areas where you are going to want to play and explore and learn about yourself. But we also need to balance that with our need to be specific enough that when you get to that chapter, weeks down the line, you know what you're supposed to be writing. So how can we think about this? Well, my partner in the memoir method, Emily Thrash, had the most amazing way to think about this the other day in our group call, and I thought I would share it with y'all. Here's what she said. Think about when you are planning a vacation. And she just went to Ireland, so this is kind of based on her trip there. When she's planning that trip, she wants to think about, how can I make sure that anything that needs to be planned in advance is planned in advance? So are you wanting to go to a particular castle? Are you wanting to walk in a particular neighborhood or village? Are you wanting to eat particular food that you need to get a reservation in advance? There are things with a vacation that it really is going to serve you to have those planned out, right? Those landmarks, those hot spots, the things that you cannot miss, those things are going to be very specific in your plan, right? Those are going to be Monday at 7 o'clock. We need to be at this address, and the car is going to pick us up and take us to this place. We'll be done at 9 and head this place. Very specific, right? But if you planned your whole vacation like that, you would have no room for just strolling around in a park that you saw one day, or going to an event that you didn't even know was going to be happening, but look, synchronicity, you're at the place and the event is happening and it's so cool. All of these things that we do spontaneously when we are visiting a new place are just as important as the things we planned, right? And if we planned our whole entire trip down to the minute, well, think of what we would miss out on, right? All of the kind of fun, creative exploration. Your outline is exactly like that. When you think about specificity, think about What are the points that if I missed that, it would be really, really bad? That needs to be in your outline. That is what your chapter description is, right? The thing that you have got to have a reservation for, or you're not going to be able to catch it. But we don't want to be so specific that if, as you're writing, another scene comes up for you, or you have an epiphany, just a writer's epiphany, of some connection that you hadn't thought of before, or something new happens and you think, oh my gosh, I've got to add this, right? We want to make sure that you have the flexibility to have your outline serve you instead of having you serve your outline. So, tip number 2, make sure you're specific enough that your outline will be useful as you start writing, but not so specific that you don't have any kind of room to grow and breathe. So, usually those 100-word, 150-word descriptions, that's a pretty good number of words. That will give you that kind of flexibility because you've got to have a pretty high level to get your chapter description in that number of words. So, think about how can I write a description, but keep it at a little bit of a higher level. Don't be too specific. Okay, my third tip. As you are writing your outline, I want you to think like an industry pro. Now, this is going to feel a little bit weird and it's probably kind of controversial, frankly. But what I want you to do as you are outlining your chapters, when you're writing those chapter descriptions, I want you to write them, number 1, in a very plain voice, very generic. You are only including information. You are not pushing yourself to add humor, for example, or add very dramatic scenes or dialogue. Generic voice. That is how industry outlines actually are, is they tend to be pretty generic and kind of have a little bit of distance from the voice of the book itself. And as an extension of this, I want you to write it in third person. Now, weird. I know it feels very, very strange to write your life story in third person, but there's a very specific reason that I want you to think about doing this, even if you decide to change it to first person in the end. And that is that when you do your outline in third person, you are allowing yourself to step back a bit from the story and see how the structure of your life naturally feeds the structure of your book or does not naturally feed the structure of your book. What I find is when we try to outline our memoir in first person, particularly if it's our first outline, it's very, very difficult to separate out the attachment you have to what the book should be from what the outline should be. These two things serve very different purposes. They have very different audiences. It's a very different type of writing. When we write our chapter summaries, again, 100, 150 words per chapter, when we write those in third person and when we give ourselves a little detachment, when we don't push ourselves to have an interesting or strong voice, what we are allowing ourselves to do is really step out of the story, give ourselves that 10,000-foot view of what the whole book is in a book where it's going to be particularly hard to do that. Once you get into the writing, you will be immersed in those past experiences you had. When you're in the outline, this is your last chance to take that step back and really see the book as a whole. So the more you can do that through things like third person, through things like a generic voice, the better off you will be when you start writing the book itself. Okay, my fourth tip is actually flows pretty neatly from our chapter summary tip, and that is once you have written that outline, once you've got all your chapter descriptions, if you want those bullet points, you've put those in there, I want you to get feedback on the outline. Now, I know this feels really weird. An outline is not typically written for an outside audience. It's really for you to help you move your book forward. Here's the thing though. When you put your outline together, if you say have 20 chapters, 100 to 150 words each, you are looking at a max of 3,000 words. And guess how much more affordable, how much faster, and how much easier it is to get feedback on 2,000 to 3,000 words than it is to get feedback on 45 to 60 to 75,000 words. Much, much, much. So if you have written your chapter outline in the same way that I mentioned in the last tip, if you've written it in third person, given it a generic voice, made sure it has a 10,000-foot view, What you can do from there is take that outline and share it with a few trusted people. Now, I have a whole video on how to get effective feedback on your writing. Head over to the YouTube channel, pull that video up, because it will talk you through literally the same tips that we give our Memoir Method members as they are getting feedback on their outline. It's a great resource. But the point I want to make here is whether or not you get a friend, whether you get a family member, whether you get someone from your writing group, or if you hire an editor, you're going to have a much easier time getting the feedback on that outline. And it's so much easier to make changes to an outline than it is to a whole book. So you can ask them things like, does the flow make sense? Are you clear on kind of how we got from point A to point B? You can ask them if there are things that are confusing, things that feel out of place. You can ask them all of these questions to really get a sense of whether your structure is working. And that's going to give you a way better sense of whether it's going to work as you start that writing process. So get some feedback. We do offer outline reviews here at Page and Podium. It's a fairly affordable service, particularly in the context of the other things we offer. So if that would be useful to you, reach out. We would love to take a look at your outline. But without further ado, the fifth tip that I have for your outline is actually not a tip for your outline. It's a trick. It is a tip for down the line. One of the things that we have seen very consistently is that once we get this outline in place, it's really, really hard to make adjustments to it. And I wanted to add this fifth tip, which is if you get off track from your outline, don't panic. Don't panic. It's okay. Every single person I have ever worked with has had to make some adjustments to their outline as they went through the writing process. Remember, we're kind of planning on this, right? We planned on it when we talked about our vacation planning versus outline planning. We know that as we go through, we're going to maybe want to move a thing here or there. That is totally okay. And in fact, it's very, very normal. The thing an outline does for you is gives you that bird's eye view. So as you are considering, do I need to make this change? Should I make this change? What would happen if I made this change? You will have such a better sense of how each individual building block, each chapter, each scene, each story, each idea, how all of those things fit together to make that book. And that means you are so much better equipped to move a little thing here or a little thing there and make sure your structure stays intact. Okay, if you are working on that outline, I know it is nobody's favorite part of the process. Outlining can really feel like a slog, particularly when you have that drive forward to get to writing. But remember, outlining time is time well spent. It is writing time. It is part of the work. So hold true to it. You know there are lots of advantages and you are going to embrace all of those. You're going to get the outline done, and I know you are going to sail into writing chapter 1. I can't wait to see what you come up with. Happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.